okay, how does the Bible relate to what we do as Franciscans? So I like to kind of think about this as how, as Franciscans, do we read the Bible? And I'll start with kind of thinking about the Franciscan vision first. So I think whenever we read the Bible, we need to have a lens that we bring to it. So I can't even, I can't read anything without these. And once I put this on, then I can read. But we have a similar problem if we're not kind of discerning how we read the Bible and what we're looking for. Because we'll see people read it in all different ways in our culture. But as Franciscans, we have a long tradition of reading it a certain way. And I think the first thing that we'll see is that we have very much a hopeful vision of the human person. And this is grounded very much in the Bible, especially the first chapter of Genesis and the first chapter of the Gospel of John. But we find many other places where that's present. And this is important, and I distinguish this, and I've worked with Mary Beth kind of on this, and I've made my own little tinkerings with it. But it's important that it's a hopeful vision rather than an optimistic vision. Optimism is not quite a biblical value, whereas hope is. And we can think of the great theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity. So we really want to come at a situation in a hopeful way. That doesn't mean that it can be easily resolved or anything like that, but it brings a certain patience, a certain confidence in God into the situation. And we really derive that hope both from the Old Testament and the New Testament, but especially from the idea of Jesus as the Word made flesh. And this is God's great gift to us. So the second thing that I like to focus on then is an abundant vision of divine action. So we'll see in many places in the Bible, we can especially think about Jesus' miracles. These are miracles of abundance, that there is so much present, that there's so much there for us. And by having that abundant vision, that helps us deal with others who come to a problem with a vision of scarcity. And I think that's a real problem in our contemporary world, where we see so much kind of scarcity thinking. But we're rooted and grounded in a God of abundance. And we see this time and again throughout the Old Testament and New Testament. And then we very much focus on the divine presence around us. And so this is this sense that we have creation, which was made by God, which we can think of in some respects as a mini incarnation. That's how Ken Osborne would refer to it. And then we can think of humanity. And so humanity is made in the image and likeness of God. And Ken would refer to that as the maxi incarnation. And so this then tells us that we can see something of God everywhere we look, in every person we deal with. And that's a unique way to come to the world. A lot of times we see that that's a difficult attitude for people to fully appreciate, but that's the roots of our Franciscan background. And then we have this idea of a continuous going beyond oneself. So we could root that very much in some basic understandings of Jesus. St. Paul will talk about the self-emptying of God into Christ. There's a notion in Greek, we talk about it, kenosis, that Jesus always gave as much as he could. And so we're encouraged then to have that going beyond oneself, emptying oneself out for others. And those are the people oftentimes who have handed their faith on to us, that have inspired us, that we remember. And we can see those virtues and oftentimes most clearly in the poor and in the simple. So we have that important aspect. And finally, we have this invitation to generous living, an invitation that you've all answered coming here to serve on the Board of Regents, and an invitation that's what makes churches work. That's also what makes all kinds of volunteer groups work, and this idea of generosity. And essentially this idea that probably most of us have experienced, that we receive so much more than we give. But when we're in that giving mentality, we have a strong sense of that. So I think this is really what I work with the students in terms of when we're reading the Bible. We aren't always going to find all these elements in a story or in a piece of scripture, but I think we can find one or two elements, and we need to kind of focus on those elements. Because oftentimes we live in a very ecumenical region. Other churches will point to other things in the Bible, and we have to be careful to kind of see the Bible through our Franciscan eyes. Otherwise, we can kind of run adrift a little bit. So very much then, this idea of generosity, of reception, of the gifts of God all around us are important. So one thing that I really like to focus on with the students is this idea of anthropology. Now, generally when we say anthropology, we think about the social sciences, and we think about exploring or understanding other cultures in the world. But from a theological perspective, we focus on anthropology in terms of how we understand the human being. And there's lots of ways that we can come at anthropology, and the different theological traditions come at anthropology in different ways. But as Franciscans, we come at anthropology in a very positive fashion. We always see the human being in a series of networks. And so, as you can kind of see from this, we can see the human being, we focus on the heart, as is in our little motto, and that heart then is in the middle of many other networks, many other relationships. And that ultimately is modeled by a God who's understood through relationship. And this is very particular to the Franciscan perspective. Because if we were to kind of look at St. Thomas Aquinas, he's often going to think of God as one, and very much a little bit without too much relationship. Whereas when we look at St. Bonaventure, when we look at Duns Scotus, they're going to focus very much on God in relationship with his Son, with the Holy Spirit. And therefore, we can see how that, we can talk about it as kind of an economy of salvation, how that works in the Godhead, and then that's modeled for us, that we need to be in relationship. We're not completely independent, and we're always finding that in the Bible and finding that exalted in the Bible. So some of the key things then when we come to an anthropology, I think particularly a Franciscan anthropology, we have that sense that we are destined to live and not to die. So we have an important sense of faith in God, and a giving God, a generous God, a God who wants us to be with him. And there's a story about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the great Lutheran theologian and ultimately victim of the Holocaust. And they say the last letter he wrote to the Bishop of Chichester in England. And the last lines he wrote were simply, "The victory is certain." He knew he was going to his death, but he had that enormous confidence. And so for us, we need to have an anthropology rooted in that type of confidence. It's echoed very clearly in something like the letter to James, chapter 10, verse 36, I believe, this confidence that we are called to have in God. The second thing is that we are destined to love and to overcome hate. So when we think about, and we'll think about this a little bit more, something like the Gospel of John, and the first 12 chapters of John's Gospel focus very much on life and how important that is. But then when we come to Jesus' passion in chapter 13 to 21, or in death, and we focus on love, that this is something that Jesus did out of love. He did not do it out of a duty. He did not do it out of a need for atonement or something like this. He did this out of a love to his beloved, to his disciples, to his friends, to those around him. And we're called to act also out of love in a similar fashion. The third thing that we focus on is that we live in this world of creation, that this is part of this so-called kind of mini incarnation, that this is all created by God. When we look at the first chapter of Genesis, we see the word most frequent there is good, that we hear it described as good 7 times. And we can see that goodness around us. And we've already spoken about the need to ground ourselves more in the care for creation earlier in our meeting today. And this would be a fundamental aspect. So when we think about those networks that were there, these are networks of humans, but they're also networks larger than humanity, and all created by God. And then the fourth thing in our anthropology would be the sense that we are destined to praise God. And so we'll see in the Psalms with great frequency this idea of praise. Even in the laments that we have in the Psalms, and I think we have about 60 laments, all but one, all but Psalm 88, end in praise of God. And that praise is this sense of how trustworthy God is, that we can have faith in God, we can trust God. And these are, I think, hallmarks of our Franciscan theology, this great emphasis on God as trusting, on God as faithful. And then we're called to move in a similar direction of Christ, to have faith in God. So these, I think, are important elements of anthropology. We can talk about it in many different ways as well, but I found these to be kind of trying to distill, especially the Psalms, and understand who we are through them, and very much having kind of a biblical perspective. So we have to come back and think about who we are, and who we are most fundamentally. So I'd like to tell a little story with this. And this is a true story that happened at Stanford about, I think, 20 years ago. In Stanford, there was an experiment done on 4-year-olds. And so they wanted to kind of understand how 4-year-olds think, how they operate, and their moral development. And so they got these 2 rooms, and it was kind of like one of these criminal CSI type shows. They had one group of children in one room, and they were all playing, and they had arts and crafts and finger paints and blocks and all this type of thing. And then they had children in another room that were all kind of sitting and watching them through one of these 2-way mirrors. So they could watch and see what was going on, but on the other side, the children just saw kind of a mirror, and they couldn't have any sense of what was going on. So they got them all going, and then they paid a child actress to come into that room with all the children playing and just be a total pill. So she would go over, to the kids that were finger painting and just kind of stick her hands in the middle and mess it all up and say, "This was ugly, why are you doing this?" The kids were building blocks or linking logs. She'd go over and kick them, and had to do all, and was just generally kind of causing all these problems. Well, all these 4-year-olds in the other room were selected because they had one common trait. They hated broccoli. And so not a hard thing to find with 4-year-olds, right? They all hated broccoli. And so with that, in comes the little girl, the little child actress announces, "My favorite snack is broccoli. And I heard we're going to have broccoli. I just love broccoli." So with that, some of the experimenters came into the room with all the children that were observing this, with 2 big plates of broccoli. And they said, "We're going to bring the broccoli in for snack time into the other room, but if you want, you can have some broccoli before we bring them in." With that, the children descended on the broccoli. They ate all of the broccoli. They said there was even some of them with little tears coming down their face as they hated the broccoli. But with the children, there was this absolute, internal sense that they have to reward the good and punish the bad. And as 4-year-olds, they knew that there had to be justice in the world. There had to be some sense that this little bad girl couldn't be able to get away with what she got away with, what she's trying to get away with. And I think that's very important for us. That tells us who we are, who God created, and oftentimes that's what we're inviting people to return to, this sense of restoration, this sense that we were made one way. Sometimes we go off track, sometimes there's difficulties in our lives, but this is who we are fundamentally. We see it when we do these little experiments on 4-year-olds. You can they've even done experiments, I've started kind of reading on this a little bit, of little babies, of 9-month-old infants, who a puppet will misbehave and the baby will hit the puppet, because the puppet was seen as being a bad puppet, So that's how we're hardwired. That's our anthropology. So as we think about our anthropology then, Part of the difficulty that we have is that there are a number of anthropologies present in the Bible. So, I don't know if any of you have ever done this, but certainly when I was younger, before I got trained properly, you'd open the Bible for inspiration. Well, sometimes you open the Bible for inspiration and you find yourself, in a lot of trouble. Not every story is equally inspiring, or it can be inspiring you in the wrong direction. And so we have to really train our students to know where to go for this vision, and to know that there are other visions, there are other perspectives. And sometimes you need that other perspective, or that other perspective is at the service of something larger. And so when we go to the beginning of the Bible, when we go to Genesis, we start with two creation stories. We start with the creation story that's very orderly, about everything being made good, being made in 6 days, having rest at the end of it. But then we have a second creation story in which we have Adam and Eve. And this isn't such an orderly story, and this isn't such a great view of humanity. Adam takes no time kind of putting Eve under him. He names her, then they misbehave, and things go kind of awry from there. So biblical scholars generally feel that that second creation story about Adam and Eve was the first one written. And we can think of the first creation story really almost like a constitution or a Magna Carta. This is what's to help us deal with everything that comes after it. And so the final editor made sure he got what he wanted, at the beginning. And so we see then in that first story some very important elements that will help us. And we can see this idea of the origin of sin and evil. But that's very much the second thing. Our origins are good. Our origins are in blessing. That's what the Bible is trying to tell us and how we find it. We have this great affirmation of humanity. And so we hear very much that we're made in the image and likeness of God. We're told to spread and to multiply. And then we have this kind of balance that we try to find in the Bible between blessing and, let's say, redemption or salvation. And that there's a place for both. But we live in a culture, and I think even the dominant tradition within the Catholic Church would be focusing, I would think it as over-focusing on redemption, on salvation. And we find that throughout the Bible, and that's a good thing. We see that in Exodus. But as Franciscans, you've heard about that other lung that we're breathing out of. That's a lung of blessing. That's a lung very much focusing on the good. And so we see that right at the beginning of the Bible. And we, as I've already spoken about, the importance of creation with all of that. And so as we think about that then, we need to think about the various stories that we hear and see how we can internalize that, or how we can look at our lives like that. Now, I've put up here a nice portrait of Queen Esther. When we read the book of Esther, especially when we read the Hebrew version of the book of Esther, we'll never hear the word God mentioned. She will never talk about anything religious. Now, there's a subtext where you, as a biblical scholar, you can kind of see what's going on. But just a plain reading of the book is a non-religious reading of the book. And yet, it's there for us in the Bible. And so I think it's there for us in the Bible to help us see how do we come at problems in our world. Certainly we're in some circles where we can quote the Bible, and that's going to be meaningful to people, and that might help them. I'm sure many of you are in other circles where people don't want to hear the Bible quoted, and yet you have to find a way to kind of work with that group of people. And the book of Esther is an important book for us to understand. And so we find a number of stories then that will really focus us on kind of real world problems that women are going through, that immigrants are going through. And we think about those. And so Joe kind of alluded to this earlier, but there's kind of two ways that we can talk about theology. We can talk about the horizontal. And so we see that very much as kind of down here, or we can think about the vertical. And so if we want to think about the vertical, perhaps the best way is to kind of think about our kind of pyramid, our hierarchy, and we can think of something like the book of Exodus. Moses ends up on the top of the mountain having an experience of God that only Moses has. Whereas Esther has an experience of God, but it's all down here with foreigners. I mean, Esther has to basically go through a beauty pageant, and probably a not very pleasant beauty pageant, and to win the salvation of the Jewish people. And so we can see stories like Esther, like Ruth, like Joseph in the book of Genesis, and these are all stories really based in blessing rather than in salvation. And so what we're trying to often do with our students, what I'm trying to do with them many times, is to kind of help them think about their own lives in theological reflections and to think about their own experiences. And that no experience is an experience where God is not present. Oftentimes, we want our God experiences to be kind of down there in the chapel, or we want them to be at the Thanksgiving table, or we want them to be in an orderly place where we can say grace or we can have something present. But the Bible tells us that God is in every experience. And so we need to really kind of work with the students in theological reflections to look at the concrete experiences of their life. And this is the great challenge oftentimes, is that oftentimes we've been formed to think of God in a transcendental way, in an airy, abstract way. But the Franciscan tradition, we see Francis, finding a leper and having an experience of the sweetness of God. So this is another kind of great challenge that we have in working with the students, to know that they can look at all the experiences of their life and reflect on those and be confident that we're going to see the Franciscan vision come through those experiences. Okay, so part of that then is the incarnation. We've spoken about the incarnation a little bit before, this idea of the Word made flesh. And ultimately, we see that incarnation in the Gospel of John, but we also see it in a lot of these stories of Esther, of Ruth, and of some of our stronger female characters in the Bible, that there's this sense that we can go across the horizontal and find God in all these experiences that we have, that we don't have to limit it to just an experience where the hierarchy is present or has sanctioned. Another very important theme that I think runs along with this is this idea of journey. And so we can see in our journey that we'll have bumpy roads sometimes, other times we'll have a smooth road. But this journey oftentimes is along the horizontal, and we bump into kind of all things coming into there. And yet, if we don't have a good anthropology, if we're not rooted well in understanding the Bible, we can think of the journey in a very kind of negative way. So we can think of kind of a traditional Christian journey, and here we would think about kind of one of the Homeric stories about trying to get past problems, and we can see that all the sailors have their ears plugged up, and they're not going to hear the sirens that are calling there. And we have Odysseus, who binds himself up so he can experience these temptations, but no one can help him. So it's just kind of getting through this. Life is kind of one damn thing after another. And so we want to, and this is often how we've been thought to think about our Christian journey, or formed. But when we look at some of the earliest images of Christ in Roman art and things like that, he'll often be portrayed like Orpheus. And so Orpheus has the same temptations, has the same difficulties. And what does he do? He creates a more beautiful song that he can get through those difficulties. And as Franciscans, I think we're focused on the same thing, that there's a beautiful song for us to hear. But we have to have ears to hear it. We have to have eyes to see it. We need to kind of correct our lens, and this is what we really work with the students in trying to do that. So as we keep on moving through this, then, we can go to John's Gospel, and I've already spoke a little bit about this, but this, I think, would probably be the most important thing for our Franciscan approach to Scripture, and Mike Guinan has written one of our books, really focused on that in the Franciscan Heritage series. But the prologue to John's Gospel is 18 verses, the first 18 verses of the book, and it's very much meant to follow up on the book of Genesis. And in some ways, it's a little bit of a corrective of the other Gospels. So when we look at Matthew and Mark, essentially Jesus starts out mimicking John the Baptist. Repent and you'll be saved. Convert. But as more theological considerations gone into Jesus in the formation of the Gospels, we come to Luke. All of a sudden, Jesus' opening words are completely different. He's announcing a year of blessing. And then we come to John's Gospel, and we're hearing about the world being made as a world of blessing. So we see in the beginning the very same words as John's Gospel, and this idea that light is greater than any darkness we may encounter. We hear about the incarnation, and then we finally look at the revealer, the only Son turned toward the Father. So we have these very important words. From his fullness we have all received grace, grace in place of grace. So this is this abundance. We all have that. That's part of everyone we're going to meet. But do we recognize that? And so we work very much with our students to recognize that. And so we have to be mindful of this negative anthropology. You can't quite read this. This doesn't come out as well. But you can see the situation. They're coming out of church. And the woman says to the minister, I really liked that stuff you were saying about all of us being sinners and how we're damned for eternity. You know? So a little bit of sarcasm there. But that's the negative anthropology that we are kind of battling. And we need to be very clear on what anthropology we're going to work with. So this ultimately comes down to a very Franciscan message that sin is not central. And that's something that probably a lot of us were brought up kind of believing, that sin was at the center. You know, before you could go to Holy Communion, you had to have reconciliation. Even I have a nephew, 8 years old, he's getting ready for Holy Communion, and he was lamenting with me, I have to go to confession first, and I really don't know what to say, and can you help me, and all this type of thing. I mean, I think all of us as youngsters kind of were in that pickle. We just didn't quite, get that. But there's this great desire for communion, for union. So sin is not central. So we'll see that sin is definitely a reality, and I'm certainly not trying to deny that, and we don't try to deny that as Franciscans. But there is also a greater reality than sin. And so we see for Francis, it's God's love that dominates. It's not sin that dominates. And once again, kind of going back to the Gospel of John, in the first 12 chapters, it's life. In the last 8 chapters, we focus on love. So when Jesus is meeting sin, when Jesus is arrested, when Jesus is suffering, we return to love in a very powerful way. And so ultimately, and this is borrowing from Mary Beth again, and as Franciscans, we talk about this Via Pulchritudinous. So pulchritude, I think, is the ugliest word in the English language for beauty. So, I mean, it means the beautiful way. It doesn't sound very beautiful. It sounds pretty guttural. But this is something that Franciscans have focused on for a long time. And I've been kind of working with Mary Beth on different projects over the last 5 years and hearing about this Via Pulchritudinous. And about 3 or 4 years ago, I was reading a document that Pope Benedict, one of his homilies that he put out, and Pope Benedict was very good for his Wednesday audiences. He usually spoke about a different Franciscan thinker. So he went through a whole litany of them, and Angela Foligno, and Bonaventure, Duns Scotus, and in one of them, he was talking about the Via Pulchritudinous. So I quickly emailed it to Mary Beth, and I said, did you see this? And she emailed me back, he's stealing my material again, And so there's this idea that there is a beautiful way. So and we can see that Pope Benedict, or you don't see here, but Pope Benedict spoke about this in some of his writings. And then, of course, Pope Francis has taken this up again. And this is a quote from Evangelii Gaudium. And just telling us about how we have to focus on the beauty during the journey. That there's going to be difficult times, but the light will outshine the darkness. The good was made first, and the victory is certain. Okay. So now we have Father Johannes.
Garrett, you talked about how your students, how do you know your students get this?
Because some of them don't. So there can be quite a bit of pushback in class, and so I'll introduce them to some ideas, and you'll get the pushback, and sometimes it takes 6 months, sometimes it takes a year. I think Randy could tell you, as she was making some of the videos for development, that some of the students said to her, well, I finally got this positive anthropology. I didn't quite understand what it was good, but now it makes sense. And so and luckily, we're all kind of teaching from this perspective. So they might think I'm crazy, but then they're going to hear it, from Father Johannes. They're going to hear it from Sister Mary Beth. And ultimately, this focus in moral theology, Sister Mary Beth will talk a lot about virtue ethics. So oftentimes when we're looking at our moral lives, we looked at it as sin, and how do I avoid sin? But in the last 20, 30 years, there's been this whole new model of virtue ethics. How do I do the good thing? How do I live the right life? So I think we complement each other, and we wear them down. So it's a war of attrition. So there we go. Yes, Carl.
If you keep keeping this, stipulating this in the background now, so you're reading the scripture, and the thing that I have struggled with, if I maybe become personal, but I expect I'm not alone in this, is the way in which the truth is delivered gets in the way of the meaning that you should extract from what's being delivered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, the idea of angels swooping down or a dream at night, that really puts me off. Whereas the message that comes through, I understand it, and this supports all of that. So how do you tell your students to deal with that?
Yeah, I think the difficulty that we have is, anytime you speak in public, and I'm sure you dealt with this, you have a wide variety of people. So you have a certain group, let's just get to the facts, let's see the red meat of this, and I'll analyze that. But then you have another group, they want to hear a story. They want to see how this changed your life. And so I think it's just a lot of different people. And so you have to come at the truth in a number of different ways. You have to explain as best you can why there's certain things that are maybe superficial or peripheral, like angels, for example. And then there's other things, like Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, that are at the absolute heart. And sometimes, people get all bent out of shape when you say everything is not of the same importance. And so it's trying to, have a message kind of broad enough, but make sure the red meat is there for the people that absolutely need that. Yeah. Tommy?
Well, I was just struck because we have our own version of fundamentalists in the Catholic Church too, who always start with sin and start with evil. And, that's kind of a real downer. But what we struggle also with in society in terms of the media is the other extreme as well. Well, it's all about me.
Right.
It's beautiful the way you articulate it, because it seems the Franciscan way is somehow or other in the middle, kind of a third way. That there is goodness, but that goodness means that I'm in a relationship and serving the community, not about.
Yeah.
We're always we seem to be struggling with two extremes all the time in society. And I think that third way is the most likely to be really nice.
Great. Thank you, Tommy.